Welcome back to the home of British politics, where we cut through the spin and say what too many people in Westminster are too timid to admit. I'm Jack.
And I'm Olivia.
Tonight, a story that sums up modern Britain in one absurd sentence. Millions of pounds are being paid out to keep a wind farm switched off, even when it's blowing a gale. Recent reporting says SSE Renewables' Viking wind farm in Shetland is receiving around £10 million a year to turn off turbines because the grid simply can't carry all that power south.
And that is the part people are sick of. You're told the country desperately needs more electricity, desperately needs more green energy, desperately needs more investment, and then when the wind actually blows, the system says, no thanks, shut it down.
It's beyond farcical. It's not just a little glitch. This is a whole model of energy policy that seems to have been built backwards. Build the turbines first, pose for the photos second, and only then discover the wires aren't there.
Exactly. The Viking site is a huge project, 103 turbines, 443 megawatts, officially described by SSE Renewables as capable of powering the equivalent of almost 500,000 homes. And yet, if the electricity cannot get to where demand is, what have you really built?
A monument. A very expensive monument.
A monument funded by ordinary people through their bills.
That's the real sting, isn't it? Because these so-called constraint payments are not magic money, they are not free money, they are ultimately part of the cost of running a broken system. NSEO itself says when the network cannot physically transfer power from one region to another, generators are asked to reduce output and are compensated for it.
So let's translate that into plain English. The public is effectively paying once to build the green dream and then paying again when the dream has to be switched off because nobody built the road out of town.
That's it. That is the scandal in one line.
And this is not some minor side issue. It goes to the heart of whether Britain's energy strategy is serious or theatrical. Because if you want a country powered by wind, solar, and electrification, you need the cables, the substations, the transmission upgrades, the storage, the boring bits.
But boring bits don't get ribbon cuttings, do they?
No, ministers don't love standing in front of a new pylon saying, look everyone, here is some competent infrastructure planning.
No, they'd rather stand in front of giant turbines and tell us we're entering a glorious new age, while quietly hoping nobody asks whether the electricity can actually leave Shetland.
And that's where public frustration comes from. People are not stupid. They can see the contradiction. They're constantly told renewables are now the cheap future. Fine, but if the cheap future involves paying wind farms to stop generating and then paying gas plants elsewhere to fill the gap when the system needs balancing, people are going to ask, cheap for whom?
Right, because the theory sounds lovely. The practice looks like managed chaos.
And to be fair, some of this is the result of geography. Shetland is remote. It's windy for a reason. The best wind resources are often far from the biggest centres of demand.
Sure, but that's not an excuse. It's the very thing planners should have accounted for at the start.
Yes, you don't get to act surprised that an island wind farm needs strong transmission links. That is not an unforeseeable event. That is the central issue.
It's a bit like building a giant reservoir and then remembering you forgot the pipes.
Or ordering a fleet of buses for a town with no roads.
Or promising a banquet and forgetting the kitchen.
You're enjoying this.
I'm angry, Olivia.
You sound delighted.
I'm delighted by the sheer honesty of the absurdity. Because this strips away all the slogans. It exposes the gap between headline politics and system reality.
And there's another uncomfortable point here. Once you create a market where constraint payments become routine, you end up with a structure that normalizes waste. Ofgem's guidance on transmission constraints exists precisely because these situations can create distortions and market power issues in constrained areas.
Which, again, in normal English, means the system can end up paying over the odds because it has boxed itself in.
Yes, and consumers are left carrying the can.
And this is where the debate gets serious. Because some people will hear this story and say, there you are, wind power is a con. I don't even think that's the only conclusion. The deeper conclusion is that bad planning is a con. Building generation without matching grid capacity is a con. Selling transition without system readiness is a con.
I agree. This story is not proof that the wind doesn't blow or that turbines cannot generate. Of course they can. It's proof that government and regulators cannot keep pretending that generation alone equals delivery.
And politically, that matters, because the public is being sold a moral crusade. Save the planet, modernize the grid, future-proof Britain. Fine. But once families realise they are funding waste, curtailment, duplication and emergency workarounds, goodwill starts to vanish.
And once goodwill goes, the whole transition becomes harder because people stop trusting the people in charge of it.
Too right. Trust is the missing fuel in so much of British politics, and stories like this pour cold water all over it.
There's also the issue of priorities. We keep hearing that Britain must move faster, build faster, electrify faster, but speed without sequencing is how you create these exact messes. It's not enough to say more renewables. The question is, more renewables connected to what?
That should be on a poster in Whitehall.
Connected to what? Connected how? Connected by when? And who pays when it all goes wrong?
And the answer, again and again, seems to be you do.
The bill payer does.
The householder does.
The small business does.
The pensioner choosing between the heating and the weekly shop does.
And that is why this story lands, because it is not abstract. It's not just about megawatts and transmission bottlenecks and balancing actions. It's about whether the public is being treated with honesty.
So let's ask the blunt question. How did a country obsessed with net zero targets end up building an energy policy where a major wind farm can sit idle in storm-force conditions while the public picks up the tab?
Because targets are easier than engineering.
Because announcements are easier than infrastructure.
Because virtue signaling is easier than system design.
And because nobody likes admitting that you cannot run a modern economy on slogans.
Now, defenders of the current approach will say grid upgrades are coming. And yes, there are major plans and investment cases for transmission reinforcement. Meso and Ofgem have both been clear that the grid needs substantial upgrades as more generation connects.
Fine, but it'll be sorted later is not much comfort when the money is going out now.
Exactly. And by the time later arrives, how many more billions will have been burned through in the meantime?
That is the killer question, because this is the danger with British politicians. They're forever promising long-term savings from short-term incompetence.
And eventually the public stops believing them.
So here's where I land on it. If you want wind power, build the grid. If you want electrification, build the network. If you want public consent, stop insulting people with nonsense. Do not tell the country energy is scarce and precious while paying producers to switch it off in a gale.
And do not pretend this is some tiny technical footnote. It's a warning sign, because if this is how the system behaves under today's pressures, what happens when even more intermittent generation comes online before the infrastructure is ready?
More curtailment, more cost, more confusion, more anger.
And less trust.
Which in politics is fatal.
The public can cope with difficult truths. What they cannot stand is expensive absurdity dressed up as competence.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
So, tonight's verdict, Britain is not just facing an energy challenge, it is facing a planning challenge, a credibility challenge, and frankly, an honesty challenge. Because paying millions to keep a wind farm idle in high winds is not a symbol of a modern system, it is a symbol of a system that has got ahead of itself.
And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to convince people that those in charge know what they're doing.
That's it from us tonight.
Thanks for listening.
And if you enjoyed this, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this episode with someone who's had enough of the spin. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to next time.